The information found in this podcast is not a substitute for help from a licensed mental health professional. Hi, and welcome to the Women in Depth podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Lourdes Viado. Join me as we explore the inner lives of women, their struggles, fears, hopes, and dreams. We'll go beneath the surface and take a deeper look at what is hidden, unknown, uncertain, and uncomfortable. Hi, and welcome back to the podcast. I'm very excited today about my guest, Dr. Stuart Eisendrath, and he's the author of When Antidepressants Aren't Enough. And the reason I am very excited about this conversation is that as a therapist, I see this often in my practice. I see it also with friends and family when antidepressants aren't working. And so I'm really excited to hear about Dr. Eisendrath's research and his work and these other ways that people can begin to shift their relationship with depression and begin to find other ways of healing. Dr. Eisendrath is the founding director of the University of California, San Francisco Depression Center. A senior clinician and research psychiatrist at UCSF, his lectures on mindfulness-based cognitive therapy for University of California TV have been viewed more than 1.5 million times. Hi, Dr. Eisendrath, and welcome to the podcast.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. As I stated earlier, I am very excited about hearing more about the work that you've done because I see this in my work. I see this in my personal life where it seems that antidepressants just aren't helping people to get to a place where they feel like I'm getting some meaningful relief. So thank you so much for your work and for being here.
Thank you.
I'd like to start with just finding out about what drew you to writing this book.
Well, I was the founder of the UCSF Depression Center, where we treated really thousands of people with clinical depression. And one thing that we were aware of is that antidepressants can be life-saving for some people and be very helpful. But unfortunately, they're not a panacea. So if you take a person or a group of people and give them antidepressants, about 30% will recover by the end of 12 weeks. If you give the remainder of that group an additional antidepressant trial, after another 12 weeks, 50% will have recovered. But that means that 50% won't have recovered. And we really wanted to develop a program that would be available for those people, that would be empowering for them and help them learn techniques that they could use themselves to help recover from depression when they had really only had partial or no response to an antidepressant. And that's what really stimulated me to develop the program that's called the Practicing Alternatives to Heal Depression study.
And so in your work with this research that you did, I just want to make sure I'm understanding it correctly. Out of all of the study participants, there was 50% which did not receive any type of relief with the antidepressants.
Actually, in our research, it was slightly different than that. We took people to enter the study. They had to have failed to recover despite 2 or more antidepressants.
Wow.
So we took people who were in that 50% who didn't recover with antidepressants. And so they had 2, 3, or more antidepressant trials that had not recovered. So we took, in a sense, the hardest group, and we entered them in our research and taught them mindfulness-based cognitive therapy and then looked at the results. And what we found was that those people improved significantly in terms of depression, in terms of anxiety, in terms of decreased rumination and increased self-compassion and increased mindfulness, all within an 8-week period. And we also studied their brain function using functional MRI, which is a technique that measures brain activation in areas of the brain from second to second. And we found, I could say more about this perhaps a little bit later if you like, but basically we found that the brain had changes in functioning that were dysfunctional in depression, and that those changes were reversed by the end of 8 weeks. So that people really had changes in their brain function learning mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. It wasn't just smoke and mirrors, but they actually took advantage of what we now call neuroplasticity,
Yeah.
the brain's ability to shift its pattern of functioning back towards a normal state.
That's powerful, to create those new neural pathways and to be able to do this in 8 weeks with a group that has had repeated non-successes with antidepressants.
Yes, in fact, the people with more severe depression actually responded the greatest in our study. So it was very interesting finding.
So for our listeners who maybe aren't as familiar with some of the language that we're using, could you share briefly what is mindfulness and what is cognitive behavioral therapy, which I think more people have heard of, but just to clarify before we move forward?
That's a good question. Mindfulness, we like to think of as being like a spotlight where you focus your attention on a certain area. It may be focusing on your breath or on your body sensations or the sounds around you. But mindfulness basically is becoming aware of what you're experiencing as you're experiencing it. So if you're noticing, there's something going on in my foot, that's what you're focused on. Or if you're noticing your breath, then you're just focusing on the breath, as it were. In terms of depression and the difference between mindfulness and cognitive behavior therapy, the traditional form of cognitive behavior therapy, I like to think of it like this. If you were in a small town and you were walking down the street and you saw a series of stores with storefront windows, in depression, those storefront windows are filled with depressive thoughts. That we know in depression, people generate a lot of negative thoughts. And as you walk down the street, you might be tempted to go in the store and buy a depressive thought and take it out of the store with you, and it becomes your own. It becomes your belief. It becomes as if you've accepted it as a fact. In traditional cognitive behavior therapy, if you recognize you're having a depressive thought, you might try to argue with it in a sense, develop an alternative or more balanced thought. So if you say to yourself, I am a bad person, you might try to counter that with some arguments about that. But what we found is that for people who've been depressed for a long period of time, it isn't so easy for them to come up with an alternative thought. In our study, people who were entering the study had been depressed for an average of 7 years. So that meant they were really stuck in a depressive state. And going back to that model of the small town, what we actually taught people is as they walk down the sidewalk, they may still notice those depressive thoughts in the storefronts, but instead of going into the store and buying that thought, they were able to keep walking and go towards their goal and values in life and noticing the thoughts, but not taking them on as if they were facts in that person's life. So it's gaining some distance or being able to decenter from the thoughts. And importantly, it doesn't mean those thoughts go away, but you just have some distance from those thoughts and are able to keep going in the directions you'd like to keep going.
I really love that metaphor of the small town and the visuals that go with that. That really helps to really illustrate these aspects of mindfulness and cognitive behavioral therapy that you're describing. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
What also came to mind for me is something I saw in your writing, and you really emphasize, shifting or changing one's relationship to depression. And I thought that was very powerful. And I can see that also illustrated in this metaphor of the small town. Can you speak to that a little bit more about this changing one's relationship to depression?
Well, yes, there's a number of factors that are woven into that. I mean, one is starting to change your relationship to those thoughts, that a person tends to have We know, for example, what the top 30 thoughts are in depressive states. We already know that. And for any one person, they may have their own top 10 that they traditionally go back to, sort of a Letterman's top 10 list that for any person they characteristically think. And so what we try to have people learn is, okay, there's a depressive thought, but instead of believing that thought, you can notice that's what your mind is generating and gain some distance from that thought. And in that sense, change your relationship to the thoughts that you're having or decenter from those thoughts. And similarly, with the depressive state itself, we teach people to have a different attitude about their depressive state. For example, many people really get more depressed about being depressed. When they notice they have some depressive feelings, they start to get depressed about it. And that only deepens the depression. I mean, depression is a painful condition, and nobody can argue with that. But it can be worsened and the suffering may increase if you increase what we call the resistance to the depression, like, oh, there's depression. And if you start saying to yourself, it's terrible, I'm depressed. I'm a weak person because I'm depressed. I should never have depression. I must have done something wrong to become depressed. If you start saying things like that to yourself and you believe them, you're going to end up feeling more depressed and suffering even more. Here's an example. If you're planning on going on a picnic today and you wake up and it's raining out, well, that really changes your plans. You can't go on a picnic very well, but you can do other things. You can go to the museum, you can go to a movie or something else. And in a sense, depression is somewhat like that. If you wake up and you feel depressed, you might say, oh, I can't do anything. But if you start to have some distance from it, some mindfulness perspective, which gives you more distance from it, you might say, okay, it's depressing out, just like as if you might say it's raining out today. It's depressing out today. I don't have to view myself critically because of that. I can choose to respond more skillfully to that depressing state. And that might mean going for a walk, going to exercise, doing a meditation, talking to a friend, talking to your doctor, talking to your therapist, any number of things, rather than being stuck in a depressive state. Just like if it's raining out, you don't have to be stuck staying in.
That's a really powerful metaphor as well. I really love that example. These are just really wonderful ways to see the concept, but to be able to actually visualize it. And I think it's easier for the person to know how to actually implement it. And I think that this acceptance of it's raining outside, it's depressing out, and even your example with the small town of, looking at the windows but not going in and not buying something, those are all examples of mindfulness too, that awareness, that shift.
Yes, exactly. Those are all ways of viewing the situation and being able to have some distance. What we like to think of it as is there's some distance between the spark and the flame. And in that distance, it gives you the freedom to respond more skillfully to the situation.
It's almost like it's giving you some space. It's not overwhelming you.
Yes, exactly.
Something else that stood out for me as I was going through your book is the comment of not believing your thoughts, that just because you're having thoughts, it doesn't mean that those are actual expressions of reality, that those are actually expressions of the symptoms of depression. And I really liked that nuance there, that we can get caught up in, I'm thinking something, so we don't ever wonder about that or evaluate that thought. And here is this process of recognizing that just these thoughts are symptoms of depression, that's what these thoughts are.
Yes, it's very, enlightening for a person, when they're in a depressed state and they have a thought like, when they say to themselves, I'm a bad person. Well, first of all, actually what they're saying is, I'm having the thought I'm a bad person.
Mm.
And once you start to have that little bit of difference, it has enormous implications, because if you recognize it's a depressive thought, it gives you a chance to respond differently to it. It's like one woman who had depressive thoughts came to a group we were having and said, I realize my mind is on a public relations campaign against me. And I have thousands of thoughts during the day about what a bad person I am. And if I believe those thoughts, it's no wonder I'm getting depressed. That's exactly correct. If you have these thoughts, you're really going to end up getting depressed if you accept them. This point was really driven home to me many years ago. When I was in college, I was participating in a protest against the Vietnam War. And the students at my college were occupying an administration building. And as I was standing there observing what was going on, the police came and lined up against the students and then began moving towards the students and hitting them. And when I read about it the next day in the paper, it was completely opposite. They said that the students attacked the police, which I knew to be completely false with my own eyes. And it was the first time I ever realized that what I read in the paper may not be accurate. I had kind of accepted, well, if you read it in the paper, it must be true. And it's exactly the same thing with your mind. Most of us, if we read it in our mind, we accept it. But the reality is what our mind generates, and if particularly in depression, may often not be true, particularly the thoughts we believe the most. So if you have a thought like, oh, my friend didn't return my email, that means they no longer like me, or it means they're angry with me. It means I upset them or something, then you're not going to be able to entertain the possibility that, oh, maybe my email I sent them got stuck in my outbox, as I know I've done on a number of occasions, or maybe it went into their spam folder, or maybe they were so busy they didn't catch my email, or they missed it by chance. All other possibilities. If you believe the former ideas that they don't like me, they want to drop me as a friend, why wouldn't you get depressed? But if you can have the distance from those thoughts and say, well, there are some other possibilities here, then it really lightens your load in a sense and gives you another possibility. So not accepting the thoughts you have as being facts are really key ingredients in shifting out of a depressive state.
It reminds me of a meme I saw about a month ago, and I just laughed at it, and I've shared it with some clients and also some friends and family, and it went something like this. Your anxiety is lying to you. You are safe and you are loved.
Yes, that's a good way of putting it. Sometimes we help people with anxiety in our mindfulness groups, and many of the people who came into our groups with depression, 3/4 of them had anxiety disorders also. And anxiety was helped just as much as the depression was. And we like to say, somewhat similar to what you just described, that anxiety has a strong element of fear. Mm-hmm. And the fear is false evidence that appears real.
I like that. Now, what was the percent again that you were saying of depression and anxiety co-occurring in your study or in the clients that you were working with?
75% of the people who had the depressive disorder also had an anxiety disorder.
Wow, that's a lot.
They're very commonly woven together. And I kind of think of depression and anxiety as being disorders of time, because with depression, the person feels as if they have already experienced a loss of a loved one, a loss of a relationship, a loss of money, a loss of a job, some type of important loss in their life. Whereas with anxiety, they're focused on the future and anticipating a loss occurring in the future. There's going to be a catastrophe. There's going to be a disaster. And what we teach people by focusing on the present moment with mindfulness is naturally antidepressant, because if you're focused on the present moment, you let go of the past and you let go of the future. You're focused on just what's happening right now in this present moment. And that's really all we have, the present moment.
Can you also speak, Dr. Eisendrath, about anger and how it plays into depression? Because I believe it's also something that comes hand in hand. I often work with clients who, there's depression, there's anxiety, and there's also a lot of anger.
Yes, they are often intertwined. When I see somebody with depression, I like to think to myself or sometimes ask them, who are you depressed at? Because often the depression may be related to somebody else who's important in their life. Take, for example, a woman who moved to our area from I'm in San Francisco, and the woman came from the East Coast with her husband, and he had gotten sort of the job of a lifetime. It was such a good job, they couldn't turn it down. And she, on the other hand, left a job in a nonprofit organization that she really loved. And so she moved along with her husband to the West Coast and then became quite depressed. And in a sense, she was depressed at her husband. And often this is the case. How could she be depressed? She wasn't allowing herself to be angry with her husband because, well, he got the job of a lifetime. How could she be angry at him for that? And what we teach people is a technique called RAIN. RAIN is, first of all, recognize, okay, there's anger present. There is anger present. And then A is allow. I'm going to allow that to be present. I'm not going to try to hide it or deny it, but I'm going to allow it to be there. Then I is I'm going to investigate it. What does it actually mean? What is going on? Do I feel hurt in some way, which is often the antecedent to anger? Do I feel upset about something? What is driving my anger? And then finally, N is taking a non-self approach to it. And that means decentering from the anger, trying to view yourself, say, there's, and fill in your name, there's Mary experiencing anger. There's Joe experiencing anger. And it helps you get some distance from the situation. And as you do so, you may start to feel a softening of your anger, sometimes what we call cooking your anger and allowing it to be more clearly identified and allowed rather than trying to hide it. And then once you recognize it, you may be able to respond more skillfully. So, for example, that woman, instead of just staying depressed and staying at home because she was so upset about what had gone on, was able to start venturing out and actually find another job in another nonprofit that she enjoyed just as much as her former job. Once she was able to move beyond the anger, she was able to really shift. And the other thing about anger is this. Matthew Ricard, a famous Buddhist philosopher, talks about compassion is the antidote for anger. Compassion. And I'll give you an example of this. I was once on a meditation retreat, which was silent for 7 days, and you're really supposed to try to do all of your daily activities from a mindful perspective. And for me, the high point of the day was eating lunch. That was the biggest meal of the day. And so I got my food tray and I sat down in the dining room and I started to eat mindfully, really trying to taste my food and bringing my attention to the sensations of eating. And as I was doing that, a person came and he sat down at my table directly across from me and he started to sniffle. Or I don't know if he started to, but he was sniffling. And he was sniffling like every 10 or 15 seconds, and it was very disturbing. And I thought to myself, why did this guy sit down next to me? Why is he doing this? You know, he's interrupting my mindfulness. This is the high point of my day. He should have sat in the corner or sat away from me. What was he doing this for? Then I said, what about this issue of compassion? Why don't I try bringing a little compassion instead of my anger to the situation? And as soon as I did that, I said, well, listen, first of all, this guy is not doing this to me. this guy is suffering. He has a cold, or he has allergies, or some other kind of condition that is causing him to sniffle. He's not really doing this to me. And as soon as I did that, my anger and irritation immediately dissipated, and I was able to go back to eat my food mindfully, just letting go of that anger and irritation. So anger can be a very powerful factor in depression, but there are ways of dealing with it as well.
That's a great story. Thank you for sharing that. You know, one of the aspects of depression that I wanted to touch on is something that I see so many of my clients struggle with, and of course, also in my personal life, with family and friends. And this is the experience of rumination. So I was wondering if you could give an example or offer a suggestion for someone who is struggling with rumination and how they can use mindfulness to stop this process, because it's such a spiral that they get stuck in.
Well, let's talk about rumination for a moment. First of all, the main form of rumination that is bothersome and drives depression is brooding over past events and saying to yourself things like, I wish I had done this differently. Maybe I was too stupid to handle it better. I should have done this. I should have said this. I should have handled the argument better. A lot of should statements, getting at personal failures and how you handled a situation. And most people don't really appreciate that rumination doesn't lead to any solution. If you ask somebody who's ruminating, you say, what are you doing? They may say, I'm ruminating. And then you say, well, what is that doing for you? They say, well, maybe it's preparing me for the future so I won't get into the same problem again. But actually, that's false. Rumination does not lead to solutions. It's a negative downward spiral, and it's a big factor in driving depression. So how can you deal with it? Well, one way you can deal with it is by becoming mindful of it. A lot of times people are ruminating without even being aware that they're ruminating. They're just stuck in the ruminative cycle. If you bring mindfulness to the process, you may notice, what are you doing? I'm ruminating again. Just recognizing that's what you're doing actually may help you break that ruminative cycle. Here I am, I'm ruminating again. This is what's going on. Then there are other approaches to it. You may choose to, once you notice it, if you feel up to it, you can let yourself bring your attention back to another area, like your breath. So you could say, there I am ruminating. I'm going to bring my attention back to my breath and let the rumination go. Sometimes that isn't so easy. Another approach to it is what we call scheduling your rumination. So if you notice yourself ruminating, you may say, okay, there I am ruminating, but I'm going to drop the rumination for now, and I'm going to save it up until 8 o'clock tonight. And then at 8 o'clock tonight, I'm going to do all my ruminating at 8 p.m. And I'm going to go full bore on the rumination later on in the evening. And that's a way of really shifting out of the rumination cycle to schedule it later. And then, of course, at 8 o'clock, you may or may not feel like ruminating, but it's a way of breaking up that ruminative cycle. But the way you can really deal with the process initially is to notice you're ruminating and then think about what it would mean to let go of the rumination. It's just like other depressive thoughts. So let's say you're meditating and focusing on your breath. Your mind is going to have a lot of different thoughts. Your mind is like a popcorn popper and generating a lot of thoughts. And if you're depressed, it's going to be a lot of depressive thoughts. But, when you're meditating and focusing on your breath, you may have a thought, well, what's for dinner tonight? Or what do I have on the schedule for tomorrow? The meditation really is noticing that your mind has wandered and bringing the attention back to the breath. And the same thing is true of meditation being useful for negative thoughts or rumination. So, I'm meditating on my breath. My mind has wandered to, I'm not a good person. I'm having the thought I'm not a good person. And then letting go of that thought and bringing the attention back to the breath. Many people make the misconception of thinking that meditation means locking your attention on one thing like the breath or on your body sensations and never having your mind wander. That isn't really meditation. Our minds always wander. It's noticing that your mind has wandered, congratulating yourself on noticing it, because that's what being mindful is about, noticing what's happening as you're experiencing it, noticing your mind has wandered, and then gently and kindly bringing the attention back to your breath.
So really, when we speak about mindfulness meditation, it's a practice of mindfulness, and it can be, I love how you describe that people sometimes have misconceptions that they need to have chimes and incense and they have to sit in the lotus position. And really, it's like what you described. It's just paying attention to what's showing up internally.
That's right. There's really two different variants, I'd say, of mindfulness meditation. One is where you may sit and either in a chair or on a cushion or whatever, and just focus on something for a discrete period of time, for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever, and focus on the breath or body sensations or sounds around you. And that's the discrete form. But there's also what we call dispositional mindfulness, where you focus on a particular thing. You shine that spotlight of attention on something as you go through your daily life. So as you're walking, you may shine the spotlight on what the sensations are like in your feet as you walk and begin to notice, wow, there's some interesting things going on. My heel strikes the ground, and then my foot rolls forward, and then my foot pushes off with the ball of my foot and the toes of my foot. And all the while, my other foot is rising up and just going through another cycle. And as you pay attention to that, it's the same type of approach when you're using that as a meditation. When your mind wanders from the sensations of your feet, you just let it go and bring the attention back to what you're focusing on.
You also have had your own personal experience with depression. Can you share how that has informed your work?
Yes, I would say it's helped me understand several things and to treat myself with more self-compassion. I mean, for people who experience depression, there's often a tendency, and I had this tendency myself, to think, oh, I'm just suffering this alone, and I'm alone in my suffering. But as you start to learn about depression, you realize on any given day, the World Health Organization estimates that over 300 million people are suffering depression. So when you're suffering depression, you're not alone. You're part of a common human experience. And that's part of what goes into self-compassion. And secondly, when I had my first episode of depression, I really had quite a few guilty thoughts, and guilty thoughts that I believed as if they were facts. And I spent a lot of time with my therapist at that point trying to go back into my history and try to unearth what kind of crime must I have committed or wished I had committed that led me to feel so guilty. Only later, when I learned more about depression, did I realize guilty thoughts are a symptom of depression. They're not the cause. And when you have a guilty thought, you don't have to accept it as being a fact. When I was working on it with my therapist initially, it was as if accepting those guilty thoughts as if they were facts, as if it was a deserved judgment, rather than really realizing those were symptoms of depression. And I didn't have to unearth some childhood cause. Rather, I had to realize they were just thoughts and not facts. And they were on my top 10 Letterman list of thoughts when I experienced depression, but that's just what they were. They weren't facts.
And you also spoke about the importance of the individuals who are experiencing depression to see depressive symptoms as recurrences of an illness and nothing more, not a personal weakness, not a failure. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about that.
Yes. Depression is a relapsing illness, that means when you have a relapse, which is not uncommon, you have different ways of having an attitude about it. Someone once said it is not the things themselves that bother us, it is rather our attitudes about those things. And if your attitude about a depressive relapse is that you're morally weak or you're defective, you're a bad person, you're going to feel worse. You're going to be more depressed about being depressed. If you understand, however, that depressive relapses are just like a relapse if you have diabetes or asthma. They happen, sometimes for clear-cut reasons, sometimes not. And if you take a person who has a depressive episode, there's about a 90% chance that they're going to have another episode over a period of 10 years. If you take a person who has 2 episodes of depression, there's about a 90% chance they'll have another episode in 3 years. So it's a very relapsing illness. That's why actually depression is the number one cause of disability in the developed world, because it starts young in people's lives and it relapses, and it causes great disability over the lifespan of the person. So it's a really challenging illness. But don't forget, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy was first developed as a relapse prevention strategy, and there's very powerful evidence of its effectiveness in preventing relapse. In one early study of it, people who had recovered from depression with an antidepressant were continued with the antidepressant or continued with it, and mindfulness-based cognitive therapy was added to their package of treatment. The people who got the additional mindfulness-based cognitive therapy had twice as good a chance of staying free of another episode over the course of a year. In an even more powerful study, people who had recovered with an antidepressant were either continued on the antidepressant for 2 years, or they received mindfulness-based cognitive therapy training and were tapered off of their antidepressant. And at the end of 2 years, both groups had essentially identical prevention of relapse.
Wow.
So it was the mindfulness-based cognitive therapy was just as good as continuing to take medication. So for people who don't want to be on medications indefinitely, this was a very convincing study of the power of the mindfulness approach to being an alternative that could be harnessed for their benefit.
And Dr. Eisendrath, I know you touched on this when we began our conversation. Can you share a little bit more about how mindfulness-based cognitive therapy and its effects on the brain itself?
Well, yes, you can think of the brain, which is obviously a complex organ, but as there are certain areas of the brain that are involved with emotion generation. For example, the limbic system, or an area called the amygdala, which is sort of like a warning center. It produces warnings to the higher levels of the brain saying there's some danger around. And in depression, that tends to be very active. Similarly, there are areas of the brain called the emotion regulation areas, such as the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And those areas help to regulate emotion, and actually, when they're functioning, help to downregulate the amygdala. In depression, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex has hypoactivation. It isn't functioning very well. Whereas the amygdala is hyperactivation. So the warning areas are high and the emotion regulations areas are low. And with mindfulness training, we saw a reversal of that over 8 weeks, where the emotion regulation areas came back online, as it were, and the warning areas diminished. So it was a normalization of the patterns that we see in depression and in anxiety, for that matter, by virtue of 8 weeks of training. So there's a definite change that took place.
That's powerful. So if we have someone who's listening and this is resonating with them and they'd like to begin to bring mindfulness into their life to begin to shift their experience and relationship with depression, what are some first steps that you suggest for them?
There are a number of possible steps the person can take. For example, they can search for a mindfulness-based cognitive therapy group in their area. And if you Google that, you can often find programs that are available in different parts of the country. If they don't have that available, or if they'd like to start out at home by themselves, my book, When Antidepressants Aren't Enough, Harnessing the Power of Mindfulness to Alleviate Depression, can be a very good place to start. The book has the essential features of the MBCT course, and it has audio files on my website that you can either download or stream, and those are actually available for free. You don't have to buy the book, but the book kind of explains more of how they're woven together. But you can try them out and see what works for you, and get started with the book as an organized way of getting a program going. Then once you're done with the book or with the course, you can carry the practice forward. There's a number of mindfulness centers around the country where you can usually go and learn more about mindfulness, perhaps have an ongoing mindfulness practice, or develop a mindfulness group yourself of people who want to get together and practice mindfulness.
And what is the best way for listeners to get in touch with you, find out more about your work, or if they'd like to work with you directly?
The best way would be my website, www.stuarteisendrath.com, and that would be has more information and some video, and also a connection to get the book if they want to do that through Amazon, or contact me through Facebook.
And we'll be sure to put those links to your website in the show notes. And that way, listeners can also go to the show notes and use those links to get in touch with you to find out more about your work. Thank you so much, Dr. Eisendrath, for taking the time today to speak with me and to share your expertise and insights on this topic. I found it very illuminating and helpful, and also validating with the work that I'm doing with my clients. And I know that I plan to recommend your book to my own clients and to family and friends. And I'm just very grateful for the work that you're doing. This is so important.
Great. Thank you very much.
Take care. Thanks so much for listening to the Women in Depth podcast. I hope it brings you a deeper understanding of yourself and others, and that you found some insights that illuminated and inspired. If you like what you hear, please consider supporting Women in Depth with a one-time or recurring donation. Any amount is appreciated and helps us continue to provide free, quality content for the world. If donating resonates with you, you can find the donation link on today's show notes. You can also follow Women in Depth on Facebook and YouTube, and if you haven't yet, please subscribe on iTunes. Again, thank you so much for listening, and see you next time.